Greetings, humans. Welcome back to the summer seminar on existential psychology. This is the end, session 8, and we're talking, let's say, existential Taoism. And what is Taoism? Look, man, I don't know. I don't know. This is a course for therapists in China. And the one thing that's clear is this: when I say Taoism, and you say Taoism, we're not necessarily talking about the same thing. The West, which is for sure a problematic construct, has a long history of reading Chinese philosophy and other works from that continent, and some folks are serious about it. Some are just dabblers, and still others are syncretists. Syncretism is kind of the belief that all old knowledge is true and kind of all new knowledge is false. And the ancients knew stuff and we don't know it. We don't know it anymore. Even when those old beliefs are like incompatible. It's like grab all the traditional knowledge, throw it in a pot, and don't worry that none of it really goes together. So I'm in the West, and I'm necessarily coming from this place of like half digested Eastern mysticism when I talk about Taoism and Buddhism. They're not my thing, and I'm not here to teach Taoism or Buddhism, much less tell the people from the culture where the stuff originated what it means. So this is borrowing back and forth, and just understand that I'm coming out of a Western tradition of finding some meaning in Eastern traditions. All right. So the two most important concepts to really penetrate here are noetics and wu wei. And I'm going to tell you what those mean. Yeah, I'm going to tell people in China what those mean to us here, not to you. So noetics would be learning without being told. The knowledge that cannot be said. Right. That first line, that first line in the Tao. The Tao that can be spoken of in words is not the constant Tao, right? We're hinting around some truth, but the truth it said is ineffable. So we have this idea of the Zen master demanding the student tell them the sound of one hand clapping. Right? It's a constant stereotype here. Tell me the sound of one hand clapping. And the student struggles and has a glib answer and then a thoughtful answer and then a deep answer, and they're all wrong. And then suddenly the light comes on in their eyes, and the master, praises them for not being right, but getting in the spirit of the question. So the question's not meant to be answered. It's meant to cause some kind of reflection that does not accord with a linear, logical way of thinking. And it's supposed to lead to some sort of mental destination recognizable by the teacher that is not an answer in words. And Wu Wei, more people would be familiar, I think. Effortless action, or sometimes effortful inaction. So, existentialism's not Taoist. The term barely shows up in any of the literature, and yet some of the ideas of existential psychology are explainable in these kind of borrowed terms that we've made our own stuff out of. Good. So there's some like preface and terminology. Unconditional regard tends to preclude diagnosis. This is somewhere we've been before, right? We're going to start stitching some things together a little bit, just a little bit more explicitly. Sick and well aren't the most useful concepts for the existential psychologist. Um, we owe something to R.D. Laing, an early proponent of radical acceptance of psychosis. He suggests that insanity is a rational response to an irrational situation. That is, someone acting normally, like their day to day selves, in the face of, for example, an atrocity, would be inappropriate behavior. An appropriate response to atrocity is something atypical for the person in their day to day life. And sometimes the only available response to situations is to go crazy. Um, what does he what does he mean? Think of an RAF pilot in World War II, sort of R.D. Laing's era. And the RAF pilot is necessarily an Anglican because we all are Anglicans in England, like it or not. And uh, no, in some ways your religious freedom is curtailed. And you're taught thou shalt not kill, right? But now you're a RAF pilot and you have to shoot down Nazi airplanes. And then you win the dogfight, and the Luftwaffe plane's going down, and the pilot ejects, parachute pops, and they're just hanging there, right? And you have this horrible, awful decision that if this man lives, then he's going to get back in another plane that I'm going to have to shoot down later. And my side, men I know and love, are gonna die. And so maybe circle back around, and there's no Geneva Convention, and you shoot that parachuting pilot, and you have thou shalt not kill, and you have this horrifying decision that must be made, and those things, they're fundamentally incompatible, right? And so you're back from the war and you're hanging out on the psychiatric ward, trying to find a way to live. And there is no way to live. There is no way to make sense of this. And the only response to this is to go crazy. Some things are not digestible by the sane. Only the insane can digest them. Right? And then, as Jiddu Krishnamurti suggests, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Right? So in my daily life, I am not concerned when I meet people who are anxious and depressed. I'm worried when I meet people who are neither anxious nor depressed. The times we're in, they demand that. They demand that response. So when a client arrives for therapy and discusses their problem, diagnosis might be functional. It might be demanded in terms of billing their insurance and getting paid. But it's probably premature and likely just not appropriate. Just not appropriate. A diagnosis puts us into a medical model of practice, right? In which the patient is sick, and we, the therapist, are behaving as junior physicians, to borrow from Dave Elkins. We attempt to cure a patient of their illness. That's medical stuff. That's not it. That's not psychology. Okay. My job isn't that. If the therapist has unconditional regard for the client, then thinking of that client as sick is necessarily counterproductive Depression is not an illness, right? It's part of the person. It's a product of their care. It's a product maybe of their sensitivity, of their empathy. I can hate the flu that's hurting you. I can't hate the depression without hating you. The doctor tries to destroy the flu virus. I cannot and must not destroy the care, the sensitivity, maybe the empathy that are making the person have this experience of depression. Diagnoses imply imperfection and abnormality and illness. If we have unconditional regard, we must accept everything about this person, right? My job is not to make sad clients become happy. Often my job is just to cry with them. That's all covered ground. Let's keep stitching. All right? You can't push the river. You have to go with the flow. Now, diagnosis creates the need for goals. If I bill the insurance company for depression treatment, I'm expected to demonstrate my treatment is successful. We're playing with other models of funding in psychology for exactly these reasons, that we're not medicos, and billing medical insurance is legally it's not fraud at all, but ethically, for those of us trying not to do medicine, it can feel fraudulent. So we might instead do something like try and get a foundation, get a grant writer, right? Get some auto dealership in town to give us money, whatever. But they equally want metrics. They want to know that the money they're giving is doing something, that it's effective at something. But also they want numbers that they can get in the newspapers and in their TV commercials, so that they are getting something for their reinvestment in the community. All right? So I'm expected to demonstrate my treatment is successful. When I'm billing insurance, when I'm taking grant money, I need metrics. So I get a baseline of suffering. I ask the client every week if they feel improved. And this often looks like this question, right? On a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being the least and 100 being the most, how much is blank thing bothering you right now? And the blank in that question is like whatever they brought up as their therapy goals. I feel so depressed. I'd like to be less depressed, all right? How much is depression bothering you this week? Next concept. Demand characteristics. Robert Hare, Canadian criminal psychologist. There was a problem in prisons, which is when people would come up for parole, it was difficult or impossible to make a parole decision that was informed on recidivism. To recidivate is to commit the crimes that got you in prison in the first place, right? So he was looking for a way to predict who would do well when released from prison and who would tend to wind up right back in prison, right? So some risk assessment, and there were no formulas, no assessments, no protocols that had any kind of reliability for that risk assessment. So Robert Hare developed the PCR psychology checklist revised, and started to assess people for psychopathy. All right, cool. The long story on this is that the situation just accounts for, in the safety of the prisoner releases, but also in just about every aspect of human life. Personality psychology is dying, because the situation is just far more predictive than any individual characteristic that you believe you can measure, right? And parole, the system puts a lot of pressure on parolees. It's not necessarily helpful. They must maintain employment, and the employment you might be able to get with a prison record is pretty scanty. You must maintain an address, and you must pay for your parole officer, and you can't live with anyone else who has any kind of a record, but you're doing a minimum wage job and spending all your money on your parole officer. Where do you have money to get a place? You get roommates, and those roommates are in your situation, and it's situationally very, very difficult for people released from prison to paroled from prison to avoid crime. Almost the only way to pay your parole officer is to hold up liquor stores, okay? The shorter story, though, is that Robert Hare develops this checklist looking for the psychopathic personalities. Read the book, it's great, it's wonderful. Without Conscience, the something world of psychopaths among us. Anyway, as often happens in psychology, he develops this checklist to evaluate individuals for a specific and helpful purpose, like IQ tests. And then science picks up that instrument and uses it for some demographic purpose, right? Just like IQ tests, they're meant to find people who can use some help, who can't access mainstream education, and we have SPED for that. But it gets used instead by racists to just give everybody and draw some undue inferences, right? And people start picking up the psychopathy checklist and just wondering, like, so you gotta go to a prison and start giving people cigarettes to sit and take this thing for you, and you find out that the rate of psychopathy in prison is quite a bit higher than the rate of psychopathy in the general population. What does that mean? What does that mean? Science rule 1: never infer causation from correlation. Can't do it. But that's our natural human tendency, to infer the one from the other. And so you just throw this out there in a room full of people, and they're like, psychopaths are dangerous. But when you get deeper, you find that psychopaths actually avoid committing crimes. Psychopaths commit crimes at a lower rate than the general population, for the same reason that immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate, right? Because they're aware of the consequences to themselves. And psychopaths in particular are quite self-centered, tend to be quite self-centered. And so things that are going to get them in trouble, they're going to avoid doing, not engage with doing. Right. So why would the test suggest the opposite? Well, back to that earlier statement. Situations create behavior far more than any individual characteristic can account for. And prison is just not a place where you want to be your cuddly Care Bear, touchy-feely, empathetic best self, man. Right? Prison's not a place where you can flourish by having empathy for other people, being easygoing about your self-interest, being authentic, right? Honesty will get you killed. People who aren't psychopathic are going to suffer terribly in prison. The situation creates the characteristic pops on that particular test. That's called a demand characteristic, right? There are these things. So I'm what you'd call a trained extrovert. I'm naturally an introvert, but my job, I'm a college professor, demands that I be outgoing. The more that I teach classes, the more my personality score skews extroverted. Uh, right, so I mean two things here. By demand characteristic, I mean two things. I mean, a diagnosis tends to result in more stereotyped behavior from the client and tends to make the client behave as a sick person becoming well. So, on that first front, um, Bob Stolero looked into psychoanalytic practice, 70s stuff. He got together some patients with undifferentiated personality disorders and assigned them for therapy to either an expert in narcissistic personality disorder was one. The other, I can't remember if it was borderline or histrionic. I'm going to say the borderline group though. And at the end of 6 months, right, puts that group, one by one in front of an independent panel for re-diagnosis. And the people who were treated by the expert in narcissism were now diagnosed, blind, diagnosed as narcissistic personality. And the people treated by the borderline expert would be diagnosed borderline. That is, the treatment for the disorders differentiated them into those disorders. Okay. More personally, I was diagnosed with autism in my 30s. And at the time, I had no experience of being autistic. Um, Explained a lot for me. Probably was a net positive. In particular, I had an explanation of my various failures that was not shameful, not personal. That is, my ability to navigate social situations isn't because I'm stupid. My affection, sometimes for things rather than people, isn't immoral. My difficulty planning or finding my way doesn't make me a bad person. This is all explicable. At the same time, I worked for decades with people who experience developmental disabilities, including some autistic people. And I had these role models of how to be autistic. They had experience, right? I found myself learning. I found myself learning from them. Especially, I learned to soothe some of my internal agitation with self-stim behavior. This is a good one. Stimming. I learned to stim. And, there are times when that is not socially appropriate, I guess. And there are times when it is very helpful. So I'm more recognizably autistic after diagnosis than before diagnosis. So there's that, right? And it's something that we would want to be careful of. Someone comes in sad and we tell them that they're depressed and we risk them taking on the role, the behaviors, the cast of the sick, depressed person. I mean that. In demand characteristic, I mean that. I also mean we're demanding the person change. If I give my client a symptoms checklist every week, they know they're expected to improve over time, consciously or not. They're going to start to answer the questions in ways that conform to these unstated but obvious expectations. This probably does not reflect reality, right? Um, their circumstances are causing them to feel helpless and hopeless. And those circumstances probably have not changed. Because that's not what therapy does. A temporary change in the ratings on the Beck Depression Inventory does not reflect a change in the lives of the clients. Their symptoms are likely to recur because they aren't symptoms of an illness, but an adaptation to an environment where objectively they're quite powerless and things aren't all that wonderful. Meds often fail for the same reason. And then it might be actively dangerous to create a false sense of agency and well being. I wrote this little story to illustrate. It's called Fear. A man feared high places. Each day he had to cross a long rope bridge to reach his fields, and each day he felt terror at the deed. The crossing was done with eyes shut tight, with feet stuck to the edges of the boards, fists white-knuckled on the rope. Sidestep by easing sidestep. One day, a traveler taught him a mantra to master his fear. He repeated it over and over again until he could cross the bridge with his eyes open. He began to grow bold, released his death grip on the rope railings, and finally took to walking in the center of the bridge. The edges, as it turned out, had been the safest part of the old boards, and the man died when he stepped through a rotten board and plunged into the river below. Existentialism, like humanism, is deeply concerned with client agency. Adrian Van Kam in 1950 wondered this. Two people refrain from stealing bread. One refrains because if they are caught, they could be punished. The other refrains because the baker is also struggling. If they steal the baker's bread, then the baker's children, their family, might go hungry. Which of these two people is good? One could argue both refrained from theft and both are therefore good. But which of those would you trust to care for your children? The one with some internal motivation for good, or the one who only fears punishment? What might they do when nobody is watching? Creating this external demand for change, even a subtle one, intrudes on a client's agency. They haven't decided in a neutral environment to make changes. They've been influenced, manipulated into some kind of change. And remember finally that helping isn't helping. Existential psych is not built on symptom reduction. Other therapies are. That's fine for them. You have to answer that question for yourself. What constitutes the good life? But in existentialism, the answer to that question is not the absence of symptoms. Recall Irv Yalom's group dynamics, particularly storming and performing, right? The group tries to help. They discover that trying isn't doing. Then they abstain from trying to help. In the gap where helping used to be, they build empathetic presence, a safe, holding space. And in that space, people start to get better, paradoxically. All the Buddhist stories, again, at least here, and in translation, have an old man meditating by the roadside. In one, he's interrupted by a young scamp. And spoiler alert, the scamp in the story is always going to be the next Buddha, okay? And the scamp, suspicious of what is obviously the performance of meditation rather than sincere work, because otherwise, why not do it in private? The scamp says, "What are you doing?" And the monk, irritated at the interruption, says, "I'm trying to meditate." And the scamp replies, "Ha! If you're trying to meditate, you aren't meditating." Stick this in your life, right? If you are trying to study, you aren't studying. If you're trying to sleep, you're not sleeping. And if you're trying to help, It's better to adopt a position of effortlessness. Wu Wei. To just be. Just be. Salvador Minuchin, at the end of his book on family systems therapy, writes, read this book and then forget about it. Don't go into the therapy room and attempt to use techniques on people. Learn the techniques, practice the techniques, get good at them, then just be with people. And I wonder if he hadn't read Bruce Lee's books on philosophy and Kung Fu. Lee demands patience with the process. In the beginning, right, when mountains are mountains, in the beginning, you will feel fast and competent because you know what you're doing. Your body already knows what you're doing. Bruce Lee assumes that he's training people who already know a martial art, just like I'm training people who already know therapy. Man. So you've already learned a technique, and when the opponent strikes at you, you know what to do. You have a programmed response. Your body knows. But then you start to unlearn. Lee is teaching you something new. It's awkward. You feel slow, sluggish, indecisive, but stick with it. Persevere. And in the end, when your body knows the new way, you will be faster than before, better than you were at the beginning. In unlearning fixed responses and learning adaptive responses, you start to become the master that you thought you were. You know, in Bruce Lee's little corner. And a lot of existentialism is unlearning. In the training last week, someone asked, how does this apply with clients? And when we got to the application, the lesson was largely to stop doing much more than what to start doing. The answer is become the earth, then sit with the moon. In his preface to A Call to Arms, Lu Xun ponders whether there is any hope. You know, people are suffocating in iron houses that cannot be escaped, but they're asleep. Shall we wake them? They cannot escape. They can only awaken to their plight, and instead of just dying, they'll suffer and die. Would they thank us for that? I used to think that was the most important part of the story. Arrogance. But just before that, he sets this stage. Right? His friend is coming to visit him in his exile. Lu Xun lives in a room of what was once a family house. His room overlooks a tree. He calls it the locust tree that people use to hang themselves at the height of their despair. And his friend has to fight his way past the neighborhood dogs, you know. And when he finally makes it into the room, there's Lu Xun sitting in the dark, translating Nietzsche and Dostoevsky into Chinese. His friend says, why? Why are you doing this? And Lu Xun replies, for no particular reason. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I don't know what that means. It's like the sound of one hand clapping. It's a paradox. This work of translating the existentialists into Chinese is a very, very heavy thing to do with just no particular aim in mind. This answer makes no sense. There is no sense to be made of it. And he runs away. He runs away from that statement into the thing about the iron houses and whatever, whatever. Just drops that bomb there, moves on. The friend says, I thought you might write something, right? And this is invitation to re-engage with the social movement of the era. Lu Xun didn't mean nothing by that. He didn't write words casually. That part of the story is there. It's there for something, a quite particular reason. I don't know the particular reason. I'm very sure there is one. He knew about Zhuangzi. He knew about the useless tree. He knew about the happiness of fish, about the knife that never needs to be sharpened, about the swimmer who arrives dry on the far bank of the river. He knew all of that stuff. Again, existential psychology is not informed by Zhuangzi or Lu Xun. At least not until like very, very recently. But these stories resonate with us. Like we find someone who's been asking the same questions. I've always said that taking existentialism to China is like taking salt to the ocean. Right? That's pointless. It's useless. It's already there. Thanks for hanging around with me. It's been my honor and privilege to do this work with you, and that's it. That's the end of the thing.